Welcome, everybody. Those who are here at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship and those who are on Zoom. Um, this is going to be a very interesting presentation. When I first heard about the chestnut tree, the first thing I thought was when I was in grade school, under the spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. That's right. So I thought about that, and so the chestnut tree was very symbolic in those days. And so this should be a very interesting presentation. I'm Mike Schachter, president of the Carolina Nature Coalition, and I want to of course, thank the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship for providing this venue here. And to Tom Shoup, who is our technical person and also our secretary for the Carolina Nature Coalition. I want to thank Public Radio East and for publicizing it on their calendar. And I want to thank our our publicity director, Connie Casey, for baking wonderful brownies and providing refreshments. So thank you. And if you haven't gotten them here, please, after the presentation, go over there. The other thing that I'm here for, of course, is to say that we live on donations only. That is, we don't get funding from any large corporations or from foundations. So if you like what we're doing, please, chip in and donate, and it'll be very helpful. There's also a donate button on our website. The donate box will be over there someplace. And now I'd like to introduce Ed Toth, who is going to introduce our speaker. And Ed Toth, because he was the one who brought this up to our attention there. So this is fantastic. Mr. Ed.
That's the fastest I ever found out I was going to say anything about about 2 seconds. Anyway, in Vermont, the headquarters of the American Chestnut Foundation was up there in Vermont. Then it moved to Asheville. And when I was up there, I did a lot of work with pollination of trees. There'd be trees that were isolated that survived, and so you'd go out there and pollinate them artificially, put a bag over them and gather the nuts. And since that time, there's been a lot of progress made. That they keep what they call back crossing, and Doug will explain that, until they try to get a tree that is disease resistant. And I'm not sure where we stand now, so Doug, tell us where we're standing.
Okay, I want to keep this pretty basic, but I'm glad to answer any questions anyone has about what I'm trying to relay to you. So I'm Doug Gillis. I'm president of Carolina's chapter, American Chestnut Foundation. Been a member since 2003, and I got interested in American chestnut when my father talked to me about it up in Barnardsville, North Carolina, on his sister's and his brother-in-law's farm. We were grouse hunting. It was November, my feet were freezing. He says, go over to the sawdust pile, dig you a hole, take your boots off, stick your feet down in there, it's smoldering, it's warm your feet up. And I watched him as he walked around the sawdust pile, and he said, hey, there's a lot of wormy chestnut laying on the ground here. My uncle had it selectively cut over, about 800 acres, half of that in wood. And then later, my father ordered about 500 board feet. We were building a den in the house we lived in Raleigh in Chestnut Hills. And we paneled that whole den with wormy American chestnut petalings. So I was 12 years old. They got me started, and when I retired, I decided that'll be a good project to work on, help restore the American chestnut. So this is about restoring a species that is functionally extinct. It still survives out in the woods, but the sprouts will only normally get no more than about an inch and a half in diameter before blight may start attacking it. There are survivor trees that get much bigger. Blight eventually gets to the tree. There's a fungus that comes in and works its way through a wound in the bark, girdles the tree, cuts all the nutrients off that going up the tree, and then eventually kills the tree. Sprouts will come up from the root collar. The tree just tries its best to keep surviving. Fortunately, mankind has come along and developed this backcross breeding, and now we're into transgenic trees. Still working on the idea that we'll be able to develop a tree eventually that will live out in the forest and be able to replicate itself. So we started off with some poetry. I'll read you what's in the anthology book. I like this poem, but it's by Turnbull Stickney from Chestnuts in November. The sweetness of all things are promises that sings our souls a little further on towards that which may be found in what is lost, which may come back again of what is gone. So that's what we're trying to do, is bring back what was gone, has gone, and then restore the American chestnut. That other poem we heard, the Village Smithy, that was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote that, I believe. But unfortunately, he was talking about a horse chestnut, which is totally different species. But the idea of the chestnut he made popular, and yeah, a lot of people think about roasting chestnuts on open fires and benefiting for all the nut crop. So let me get into the slide presentation. So the American Chestnut Foundation, probably some 5,000 to 6,000 members up and down the East Coast, from Maine down to Georgia, Alabama, out to the Mississippi River, up into Ohio and Indiana. There's 18 different states, 16 different state chapters, and a lot of people working towards this effort. We have a small staff of dedicated employees of the American Chestnut Foundation, and they do a remarkable job of keeping all the work going, and not only helping volunteers, but also working with partners, universities, and other folks to advance the idea of restoring the American chestnut. So this is a range map of what we think is the American chestnut range back in the late 1800s. The darker green color shows that, and this, a lot of it is in foothills and mountain areas, and then even stretching out the Mississippi River. And there were maybe 4 billion trees at one time, of a lot of them, you know, maybe 4 feet in diameter on average, but up to maybe 8, 10, 12 feet in diameter. You can see this tree's hollowed out at the bottom, but just how big it was, and people standing in that open area. The other picture is a tall, straight grain, tall growing American chestnut, and the little red circle on the bottom shows you the size of a man standing beside it. And one of the benefits of American chestnut was it was a good timber tree that provided a very good, reliable nut crop. It blooms in the usually late June, so frost rarely ever affects the blooming in the nut crop. And then also it has a lot of tannic acid, so the tree was used for extracting tannic acid and for the leather industry and other purposes. The wood is very rot resistant. And then obviously a lot of people in the 1700s, 1800s, they would build log cabins using the American chestnut wood, and some of those still stand. There's one at Ann Springs Close Greenway in Rock Hill, North Carolina, just south of Charlotte, that built in the 1780s that was restored. The wood just got rotten. But the blight came in to the Americas maybe sometime in the late 1800s, but it wasn't recognized until 1904 up in the Bronx Zoo in New York City. And then from there, it started spreading southward, a little bit northward, about 50 miles per year. And then by the late 1940s, it was down into Alabama and also Georgia. Jimmy Carter, honorary member of the American Chestnut Foundation, remembers collecting chestnuts from a tree on his father's farm as a youth, taking them to school and trading them for marbles because no one else had chestnuts. But then when he returned for duty with the Navy in the late 40s, the trees were on the way out because of the blight. So this is a picture that shows what's called ghost tree on the right, just tree just totally devastated by the blight. The fungus, you can see from the picture, the reddish color, but it sporiates and then will get into the air and spread to other trees. Insects, birds, other animals will help spread it. Just wind-blown spores will get to other trees. And then it resides on trees now, even though a lot of the chestnuts are gone. The tree just, the fungus still resides on trees, and if you plant an American chestnut that doesn't have any resistance, it's apt to be attacked by the blight again, eventually. So this slide here just shows some of the work being done to identify where chestnut trees are surviving. And this was 2010, but we just keep track of that so we know where the trees are. But again, a lot of these trees are small stem trees, but it's important to keep the genetic material available for further breeding. And then we encourage people to find chestnuts. You can see the catkins on the picture, the yellowish, whitish, hairy things. That is the male pollen. There's a female flower on a little tiny burr, and then it takes two trees across. A chestnut doesn't self-pollinate, so another nearby tree will pollinate the female flowers, and then it'll eventually create a burr, as you see, with three nuts inside. Now, the chestnut species itself is kind of complex. There's probably 9 different species of chestnuts. You've got 4 in North America, which include the American chestnut, and then there's a Alabamian variety, which has just recently been identified as like an American with a little bit of different characteristics. And then you got the Ozark chinkapin and the Allegheny chinkapin. Over in Asia, you got the Chinese chestnut, Japanese chestnut. Then you got 2 varieties of Asian chinkapins. There's also Korean chestnut. And then over in Europe, you've got the sweet European chestnut. So got all those different varieties, but the thought is that some 50 million years ago, it may have been, trying to think of the word, Castanopsis was a species that maybe is the origin of the chestnut trees. And then there was some migration of the tree from Asia to Europe and then maybe over North America. But the thought is that the European chestnut, which is also susceptible to the blight, is probably got more resistance than any other chestnut except for the Chinese chestnut. And the American chestnut has no resistance to the blight, which is unfortunate, but it was more or less isolated in North America and didn't cross early on with some of these other species. But the blight itself actually probably never developed until after this migration of the trees started. So fortunately, the Asian trees have resistance. So we have a, and again, quickly, this is just leaf identification. One on the left is American. Then the next one, the more round one, Chinese. The little one up at the top, that is chinkapin. And then the third one from the left would be the European, and then the further right one is the Japanese. So they all have these teeth on them, so it kind of helps identify the chestnut species. And then the nuts vary in size. The American is actually a fairly small nut compared to the one on the left there at the bottom. And then the largest ones are the European and the Japanese. Here's a good picture of an American chestnut leaf. If you're up in the mountains, foothills, hiking around, you might be able to identify some of the sprouts that are still viable and living. And there is a very good way to identify American chestnuts, but it takes a good microscope. That lower picture that shows the hairs on the back of the leaves can be detected with a high-power microscope. And the American chestnut has very few straight stellate hairs, but other chestnut species are fairly hairy. So when we're going to try to identify which species a particular tree is, it takes some work with a microscope to determine, is this an American, or is it European, or is it some hybrid? The Asian trees are all very hairy on the backside, so they're fairly easy to identify. You can see that leaf turned over is kind of whitish compared to the glossy front. That's, I think, Chinese chestnut, but it shows you how hairy the leaf is. And then occasionally we'll find large surviving trees. This one on the right, that may be what was called the Berlin tree that was up in Maine, I believe. And unfortunately, it's died of the blight. So compare the American chestnut with the Chinese and Japanese chestnuts. The American has no resistance to the blight. It also is subject to root rot disease, Phytophthora parasitica. That's Phytophthora parasitic. That's the fungus, the Phytophthora cinnamomi, that's the root rot. But it has those two different diseases that attack the tree. So what we're doing with American chestnut, the back cross breeding program, is trying to introduce resistance from the Chinese and Japanese trees into the American tree to give it resistance. So you can see the American may grow 80 to 100 feet tall. The Chinese, Japanese, only 40 to 60 feet tall. So part of the process of this back cross breeding is to, there you go. Part of this breeding effort is to do, as Ed was saying, we take a flowering tree that's American, and then we'll go in the early spring and strip off the male catkins around the female flower. We'll put a bag over the female flower, and then we'll bring in pollen from a known source that has been developed to have some resistance to the blight. And then we'll just hand pollinate the female flower, put the bag back over the female flower, and then let the nut develop, and then beat the squirrels to the bag before they tear it open and get the nuts. And then we save those nuts. You can imagine those burrs are hard to handle, but usually people with real heavy gloves and a good knife will shell out the nuts. We have to winterize the nuts to get them to develop a radical root. So we do that by taking some damp peat moss material, the powdery kind, damp enough to where you squeeze it and maybe a little water might drop out of it. Put it in a Ziploc type bag, punch a few holes in it for air to circulate, stick the nuts in there, put it in the refrigerator, and then wait several months. And then by, say, late February, early March, this little white radical root will start growing out of the nut. Then we can put it out in the ground, and the stem and the leaves will pop up shortly, and then we'll be able to grow those hand-pollinated nuts for another generation. Now, the backcross process takes about 5 generations. I'm looking for a slide that may have that. right there you go. William, or, let me get, Charles Burnham developed, corn genetics and then applied that to the American chestnut. And the backcross process starts with an American crossed with a Chinese. We call that F1. So it's 50-50 variety. Then because the Asian chestnut has these characteristics that we don't want, like lower growing, branching out early, flowering out early in the forest, more susceptible to frost killing the burrs. We backcross it for 3 generations to the American chestnut, and then we look at each generation and just select it for good American growing characteristics. And then we also inoculate the varieties with a fungus, one not so virulent, another fairly virulent. And then we look at the size of the cankers that develop as a result of those inoculations. So the tree has to grow in the orchard 5 years, and then you do this inoculation. That takes another 6 months or so. And then the result is you may select 5 to 10% of the trees you grew that year to go on and do further breeding with the next generation. So we got the F1, first backcross would be B1F1, second backcross B2F1, third backcross B3F1, and then we intercross them, and we finally get up to a B3F3. So 3 doses of the Chinese genes and 3 doses of backcrossing. And traditionally that takes maybe 5 years for a generation. Well, we have now sped that whole process up to where we can do the small stem analysis of how the tree reacts to fungus, looking at an inoculated stem. We got high growth light chambers. We can grow a chestnut within a year or 2 and then have it pollinated, develop pollen and flowers. So instead of 15 years, we may be down to 3 years. So we've sped the process up. We're trying to get where we're more efficient with selecting out the better trees. We're at a point now, this slide that says best by best is that this particular orchard is up in Edneyville, North Carolina, and we got a few trees up there that have very good resistance to the blight. And then we're bringing in the spring pollen from better trees than other orchards, and we're crossing everything again. And the whole hope is the more crossing we do, the more selection we do with the backcross program, we'll still eventually be able to get a very good resistant tree to the blight. We also are doing well, let me just back up. You can see the bark of a tree that's unaffected, but this other bark, that's called a cruddy bark. So that tree has a little bit of resistance. We getting ahead of myself on the slides a little bit, but we also do breeding for root rot resistance. So Joe James down in Seneca, North Carolina, is breeding trees that have resistance to root rot. And once again, the Asian trees have resistance to root rot. And he's breeding trees that are then crossed back to these American chestnut hybrids. And the whole effort is to not only have a blight-resistant tree, but have a tree that resists root rot as well. Root rot is more prevalent in the Piedmont areas because it's waterborne pathogen. And up in the higher elevations, due to cold weather, better drainage of soil, it's not so much a problem. But we still want to be able to plant out American chestnuts, not only in the mountains and foothills, but also in the Piedmont area. So that's important to have both the backcross for blight resistance from the fungus and then also resistance from root rot. So we are now into doing biotechnology where we're doing transgenics and cisgenics. So the transgenics is basically taking another plant in inserting that into the American chestnut genes, chromosomes. Cisgenetics is trying to manipulate the genetics of the tree by using technology to splice in other genes. An example of the transgenic work is State University of New York School of Science and Forestry developed a tree called the Darwin, where they took a wheat gene, inserted that into American chestnut genome, and then replicated that. And the wheat gene creates a reaction to the fungus attack, much like a Chinese chestnut tree would do out in the wild. So it's kind of replicating that whole process. So further work is going on. American Chestnut Foundation is no longer working with SUNY, but they do have other partners. So what we're hoping to do is use some of this technology for transgenics and also cisgenics, which is splicing stuff into the genes in order to create a transgenic tree that has characteristics that resist the blight. So we haven't figured out quite what to do with the root rot issue yet, but if we can just get a tree that's resistant to blight to begin with, we can cross that back with these other trees that have root rot resistance and then incorporate the root rot resistance into the lines we're trying to breed. So this is all quite complicated. We are working on biotechnology efforts. Let me look at a few slides here. So one of the other efforts is using, there's a hypovirus, which is a virus which attacks the blight itself. And this is more prevalent over in Europe, where the European chestnut tree is attacked by the blight. And this virus kind of evolves with the fungus on that particular tree, and it will weaken the fungus and keep it at bay, and the tree can continue to survive. The problem here in North America, there's so many different varieties of the fungal blight that we don't have a universal inoculum. We can't right now take this hypovirus from one tree and then apply it to another tree and then have good results. But we hope genetically we'll be able to come up with a solution there and manipulate it to where we may have a universal way to inoculate trees with hypovirus and at least weaken the fungal attack to the point where it won't kill the tree. And all this sequencing and genomics, that's a little bit far beyond me, but we're working with Hudson Alpha in Huntsville, Alabama, and they're doing a lot of great work to help us out with sequencing both the Chinese and the American chestnut genome, and then that'll help us with some of the work we do to try to figure out how to splice in stuff to the American chestnut gene to eventually give it some blight resistance characteristics. And what's good about that, being able to do the either the transgenic or cisgenic approaches, is that we'll have a tree that's virtually 100% American chestnut and maybe just has a gene inserted. The backcross method, at best, we might have a tree that's 95% American and 5% Chinese. So this work with SUNY started out with trying to permit, going through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and then the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I probably mentioned them. But three organizations are working on the deregulation with SUNY. Now, we don't know when that is going to happen, how that may happen. And then if TAC itself gets involved in developing some transgenic tree, we'll have to also go through a permitting process. The concern is if we develop these transgenic trees, put them out in the forest, are they going to be safe? Are they going to create any problems? So it takes a lot of research and analysis just to prove the point that no, it's like if you have a wheat gene, that's the only thing you're putting in there. That's a common gene that's elsewhere out in the environment, and it's not going to create any real issues. So, if you are interested in helping restore the American chestnut, you can become a member. I've got some brochures on a table out here that just will help you join if you're interested in joining. Annual membership is only $40 a year. You get $15 that goes to the chapter, Carolinas chapter, but you get 3 nice publications a year and other information. Whether you join or not, you can go on the website. It's called TACF, the American Chestnut Foundation, but TACF.org, and go on that website, and you can find a lot of information. And if you really want to get into the transgenic and cisgenic stuff, you can delve down into that. But there's also resources pages that old magazine articles, probably no more than a year old. There's also a chestnut chat series. We're going to have one tomorrow, and those are all archived. And if you're interested, that's a good place to just get started and learn a little bit more about the American chestnut. And if you want to plant some, there are members can buy wild American trees, plant them. You can get hybrid trees if you become a seed level member at $300 to $500 to $1,000 range. And then we do have orchard work going on, but that's mostly up in the mountain areas. Be a little bit of a trip up there to do that. And then finding trees, you're basically going to have to be in the mountains, hiking around to find trees. But it's kind of an interesting process to learn about all this, and especially get younger children excited about the American chestnut, because a lot of our members are aging out. And we do seem to be picking up interest, though, in the younger people, especially through schools and universities, where the science alone is very interesting, just to get involved in all this science work and lab work, and learn about that and be involved in that. So when we are preserving native germplasm, what we're doing is going out and collecting seed. We have a guy that collects maybe 1,800, 2,000 seed a year, brings them back. He'll winterize them. We plant them in orchards. We distribute some to other state chapters, but we're trying to preserve as much of the genetics of the American chestnut in these localized orchards so we can do further breeding in the future. Especially if we get a transgenic tree, we'll have American chestnuts right there where we can do easy pollinations. So these are just some slides of some orchards. A bunch of chestnuts have been harvested. So, got any questions? Yes, go ahead.
Let me bring the mic to you. So, there
okay.
it, that was on. So that the people online can hear you also.
Are there any restrictions on harvesting chestnut trees?
The nuts or the trees? Either one. Yeah.
The tree itself, the wood of it.
Of the wood?
Yeah.
Well, you're not going to find any tree of any size here in the Carolinas because the blight normally gets them. The largest trees that I know of were up around 2 feet in diameter. Eustace Conway's brother, Walton Conway, I don't know if you know who Eustace Conway is, but his brother had about a 2-foot diameter one up near Todd, North Carolina, and it died. Now, what I tell people to do, if a tree dies, salvage the wood. Don't cut it up for firewood because it's very rare, very valuable wood. But those are trees that are very, very far and few between. If you want to collect nuts, and they're American chestnuts, and then if you're on state forestry land or Blue Ridge Parkway, you need a permit to do that. But we'll collect nuts for our research and under a permit. Now, if you go out to Oregon like I do, there's trees out there that pioneers took west with them as early as the 1860s. And some of those trees are now like 7 feet, 8 feet in diameter. And occasionally they die. I know a couple that have died out there recently, and I got on to some, well, in fact, he worked with the Park Administration in Portland, and I told him, I said, one of your American chestnut trees was cut down. I don't know what happened to it. If that happens again, salvage the wood. So this one died, and then one next to it died, just old age. And fortunately, yeah, the neighborhood got together and they salvaged the wood and they used it as a fundraiser. But that's what I like to see. I mean, such a rare thing to see a tree that size. You'd hate to see it chipped up and turned into charcoal. Any other questions?
So is the only place that American chestnut trees growing now are in controlled orchards, controlled areas?
No, out in the wild, we refer to these as wild American. There are sprouts out there. I've been in places along the Blue Ridge, well, along the AT, where I've seen hundreds of trees in the understory, but they're no more than a foot or two tall. It just happens there's a tree nearby that spread a bunch of nuts. The blight eventually will get those trees. Now, the hybrid trees, yes, they're all in orchards. I think over the years, we maybe have 45 different orchards in the Carolinas where we're breeding, and maybe a dozen of those are still active where we'll go in and continue to do these hand pollinations or collect pollen, take them to another orchard and crossbreed. And then that's true of a lot of the states all the way from Alabama, Georgia, all the way up into Maine.
I just have one more question. What's the difference between an American chestnut tree and a horse chestnut tree?
Well, they're totally different species. Let me put this down. The horse chestnut tree has a palmated leaf. It'll have like 5 leaves that come out with one stem, and then it has a burr that's called a conker. So it's kind of nubby and smooth, and it's not edible. It's toxic to humans. They call it a horse chestnut because in England they'll make a tea out of it and feed it to horses to control some of their dietary problems. And you can, I think, get rendered horse chestnut also for the same purpose for humans, but it's been detoxified. Don't eat a horse chestnut. They look a lot alike, and so the leaf pattern is very distinctive and different. Yes.
Yeah, maybe I missed it in the beginning, but where did the blight come from? How did it get started?
Well, it came from Asia somehow, and we think it was just brought in on plant material and possibly on just wood that was infected, and the fungus was there and spread. But again, it was first recognized in 1904 up in Bronx Zoo. But we think there may have been little pockets elsewhere. Even, I think maybe Thomas Jefferson was experimenting with European chestnuts and Asian chestnuts. So there may have been other pockets where this blight was introduced. The root rot came in, it's called Phytophthora cinnamomum, for the cinnamon connection is from Papua New Guinea. So they think that especially not orchids, but azaleas and varieties like that were infected and then were taken to Europe, and then from Europe brought into the colony. So by the 1700s, it was being introduced into the South. And then because it's a waterborne pathogen, it got spread around in the water table, on draft animals' feet, on farm implements that were shared, and on the plant stock that was shared. So, but it's a very prevalent problem. I hear that maybe 1,000 different species are affected by this Phytophthora cinnamomum. And plant nurseries have to deal with that because, it kills plants outright. I mean, they don't survive, whereas the fungus will kill the top of the tree, but the root system will still survive and more chestnuts will sprout out. So that's, the other terrible pathogen is the root rot. Yes.
In the early 20th century, when this was recognized, were these trees harvested for the wood? I mean, that's a tremendous resource.
Yeah, I did an article for the Chestnut magazine about a paper written in, I think it was 19 and maybe 21 was when it was published, but, the tree was already being over harvested, in the 1800s, and particularly up in by 1880s or 90s, there was a concern that too much harvesting was going on. They were using it for core wood, producing charcoal, panic acid extraction. And when the blight came in, they couldn't figure out exactly what it was, how to control it. It was spreading south. So when it got down to Pennsylvania, I think the Pennsylvania forestry people decided, well, let's just cut a 30-mile wide swath and get all the chestnuts cut down, and hopefully it won't spread any further. Well, it just leapfrogged over all that and kept going. The use of the wood, though, if it could be harvested, I mean, the wood is still very valuable. It's very rot resistant. It may lay on the ground 10, 20 years, and the main core of it is still good, solid wood. Champion Paper Company up in Canton, North Carolina, I think they may have changed their names now, but in the 1930s, 40s, they salvaged a lot of this fallen American chestnut wood, and they were mainly using it to extract tannin, but also all the pulp that was left. They realized, well, we make paper out of this. So that's how they got into the paper business. But there was probably one time just so much wood laying on the ground. It was there for the taking somewhat. And it's just a tragedy, a very unfortunate thing.
How far east did these trees survive? Did these
Well-
trees have been in eastern North Carolina?
Yeah, that range map I showed you, I'd say the western Piedmont was maybe the edge of the range. I mentioned this cabin that was built down near Fort Mill along the Catawba River. That was from wood harvested right there in that area. So the furthest east we know is there was a pocket somewhere southeast of Fayetteville, North Carolina. And that's kind of an oddity. There's some pockets up around the Uwharrie Mountains. And one thought is maybe Native Americans took chestnuts and planted them out in some of these areas just to have a nut crop. But I'd say the foothills and a little bit of western Piedmont was kind of the limit of where the natural spread of the chestnut. And part of what we don't know is just how much further east they might have been, because the root rot wiped out what was left of the American chestnut in the Piedmont by the mid maybe 1875 era. Soldiers walking back to the South, particularly after the loss of the Civil War, and this was the 1865 era, they were just commenting on what happened to all the American chestnuts in the Piedmont. They're gone. So root rot during the course of the war had taken out a good number of them.
Is the fungus ubiquitous?
Ubiquitous?
Yeah, is it out here in the woods? Survive?
Yeah, it's possible. People have planted especially Chinese chestnuts to replace the nut crop from the American chestnut. And because of that, the Chinese chestnut, I lived in the Chestnut Hills in North Carolina, in Raleigh, and we had Chinese chestnuts in our yard, and they would have fungus on them. But the tree would resist that. At best, maybe a limb died. But it's just an example. If you got Chinese chestnut trees that have the fungus will reside on other trees in the forest. And it's just hanging on, lingering there. It'll attack a chestnut and kill it.
How tall did you say the American chestnut grew before this blight?
Yeah, out in the forest area, where it's dominant, it typically would be at least 100 feet tall. I don't know that it grew much taller than that, but there are stories of sometimes a tree might survive 300-400 years. So it's just a massive tree, long-lived. One of the problems with it and any other large tree is they tend to hollow out in the base, and that kind of weakens the tree. Some of these trees out in the Pacific Northwest, I know of, that has happened to them, and then storms come along and blow them over. But I mean, that happens to oaks. It can happen to chestnuts and other large trees. You saw that picture of the people that were gathered in under the opening in the base of that big chestnut tree. Okay.
Has anybody tried to find something that kills the fungus? Instead
Uh,
of making the tree more resistant, why aren't we finding something to attack the fungus?
Right. Well, that hypovirus I referred to that attacks the fungus, but it kind of evolves with a particular strain of the fungus. So yeah, we're looking for ways to maybe take hypovirus and make it a universal inoculum to kill off the blight or weaken the blight. And even Robert Frost wrote a poem about what happened to the chestnut tree, and will some other thing come along and wipe out the fungus. So that was back in the 1930s. I think he was writing about that idea. So hypovirus was recognized after he wrote that poem.
Is there a registry of where the chestnut trees that are still alive are found?
Yes, most states have what they call a big tree registry, and you can go there and see if American chestnut's listed or not.
Okay, because I know where one is, and I didn't know about checking it. It's in Maryland.
Oh,
So
so an
I've been eating off of this last fall.
American
They-
chestnut, or
Well, they're good. I don't know. I was looking at the leaf. They look like American. It's a huge tree, and the nuts, the squirrels would get them too. I usually have that 5 a day. I thought 5 a day, and I'd open them up and eat them. I eat them
well,
raw.
if you're interested in determining whether or not it's an American chestnut or not, if you go on the tacf.org website, on that front page, it has, "Have you found a chestnut?" And then you look at that, and then it has a PDF file that helps you identify what the leaves and buds and burrs all look like. But you can also collect samples and send them to Asheville, and then have an expert analyze the leaf sample and stuff you send in to identify whether or not it's an American chestnut. So that's a good way to check all that out. But where is this tree that you're referring to?
It's like still Maryland.
Oh, okay. That's possible. I mean, there are some, so what you call survivor trees or escape trees, which the blight hadn't got to yet.
Are there any other varieties of the one that I ate is tastes really good. Are other varieties taste good too?
Well, if you're a nut, they're all good tasting things. But the American chestnut is said to be, well, let me back up. The chinkapin, which is pea size, is supposed to be sweetest. American chestnut is the sweetest of the bigger chestnuts. Then the European chestnut is called a sweet chestnut, but Chinese, Japanese, they aren't all that sweet. I mean, you can get Chinese chestnut at the farmer's market usually, but if I'm cooking something and using them, I'll add some sugar or something like that, give them a little sweeter taste.
Okay, two comments and then a question. A
Okay.
comment in, there was a house in southern part of Connecticut built in 1726, and it was mostly chestnut, and what was amazing is the wainscoting was about 3.5 feet high, and it was solid planks of chestnut. And then western Massachusetts, up towards the Vermont border, the forest parts there would be as much as 75% of the forest canopy would be chestnut.
Yep.
So, I mean, it's amazing what we lost. Now, the question is, because of the range of chestnut from northern New England all the way down to Alabama. Are there other areas that are doing the same thing to try to get genetic diversity across the whole range?
With the American chestnut,
Yeah. Because
Yeah.
because the Vermont chestnut grows very different. The climate's very different than Alabama.
right, so part of the thinking is, last glaciation period when we had the ice sheets coming down into the south, it wiped out all the trees. And then as that retreated, there were chestnut trees maybe in northern Alabama, parts of Tennessee, Georgia, that survived. They weren't wiped out. And then as the glaciers retreated, the trees on the edge replicated themselves, but those are all fairly similar genetically. So recently we have identified what's called a Alabama-nese, I think's the word, chestnut. So it's an American chestnut, but it has maybe some characteristics possibly of chinkapin, and it's different from the American chestnut. So that's an example of some different genetic variety. And then also we're interested in trees that are wild trees are being used in the warmer climates in the south versus the colder climates in the north. So we are trying to breed in all this genetic diversity and preserve it for the purposes of if there's something important about the genetic diversities for cold climates or warmer climates, that we can capture some of that genetic material and then breed that into the program.
Any more questions? Well, if there's no more, thank you, Doug.
Oh, you're welcome.
This has been wonderful. You are a font of information. And,
Well, I
just
hope what
appreciate-
I was talking about off the cuff is a lot more interesting. And all, I mean, if you want to know about all the really tough scientific stuff going on, just go on the website and you can get a whole plethora of information.
But thank you once
You're
again.
welcome. And I was going to take that, but I don't just pull it out or get it
We'll
later.
get it for you. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. And I just want to remind you that we live on donations alone. And I was said that I have to move in front of there we go. And so if you're here, we do have the donation bucket up there. And so give, and there's still some food. And those online, you can donate online, go to our website, CarolinaNatureCoalition.org, and have a good evening.